I think what the Biden administration is really going to do is press both sides to say, okay, we're committing to a path here that can lead to, an independent Palestinian state. But the Netanyahu government is so extreme, so conservative. He's relying on them for his political survival. And there's no way they'll entertain anything remotely approaching a meaningful dialogue with the Palestinians.
The body of an Israeli hostage has been recovered from Gaza City. That's according to the Israeli military. Judith Weiss's remains were found in a building near the Al-Shifa hospital complex, where Israeli soldiers have been searching for evidence of a Hamas command center. The Israeli Defense Forces believe Weiss's kidnappers had escaped before the soldiers arrived, and she's on the front page of The Guardian, as you'll see tomorrow morning. Well, joining me now is Frank Lowenstein, who is the former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations and former US Special Envoy for the Middle East. Frank, hello, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Just looking at a picture of Judith Weiss, 60. She's in her 60s. She was abducted from the Be'eri kibbutz by Hamas militants on the 7th of October. And sadly, the IDF have confirmed she has died or was killed. Just looking at the picture of her just crouching, smiling. It's a sunny day. She's sitting there against a backdrop of lovely flowers in bloom, and it really will concentrate minds about the human costs, individual costs, and hostages are still there, being detained.
Yeah, well, obviously it's incredibly tragic. I also think that it will have the impact on the Netanyahu government of increasing pressure on them to negotiate for the release of as many hostages as they possibly can. There's apparently been an offer on the table. They've been going back and forth, release maybe 50 hostages, maybe more, women and children in return for women and children who are held in Israeli jails. I think the pressure will increase on Netanyahu to explore that kind of a deal, which will likely be accompanied by a 3 or 4 day ceasefire, which would allow for more humanitarian assistance to get in. So yeah, it's incredibly tragic. I also think it will have an impact on the calculus of the Israeli government going forward.
That's right, because every day now, pretty much, we see relatives of the hostages turning up in Tel Aviv saying, we want you to do everything it takes to get our loved ones out. But you get the impression that the war cabinet is saying, sorry, we need to finish the job. We need to destroy Hamas. And you get the impression that if, sadly, it means a number of hostages are killed, then so be it.
I think that's pretty much correct, Henry. I think it's more or less the way they're looking at it. If you hear Netanyahu talk about their goals, it's to defeat and destroy Hamas and release the hostages, but sort of in that order. And if at any point those two objectives come into conflict, I think the desire to crush Hamas will take precedence. That being said, there is a march going on from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem with hundreds of family members and other protesters saying, hey, more needs to be done to get the hostages out. So I wouldn't be surprised if this resulted in some kind of a prisoner deal in the next few days, accompanied by a ceasefire. I just don't think it's going to change the long-term trajectory of the conflict.
Yeah. And what about the IDF taking journalists on a tour of the Al-Shifa hospital, claiming to have found evidence of a major command center? How convinced are you, how persuaded are you by the pictures that we're seeing, that this was some major command center that required the bombing of buildings and other structures in the very near vicinity of that hospital?
Yeah, I mean, the images that they had today, there was pictures of AK-47s that they found in an MRI room, and then they showed the picture of the entrance to a tunnel. I think they need to show more in terms of what was going on underground the hospital, because based on what we've seen right now, it doesn't appear to rise to the level of justifying the kind of assault we've seen on that hospital. That being said, the United States did come out and say there's a Hamas command and control center underneath that hospital. Joe Biden said that personally. There's no way the president says that unless we have very, very compelling intelligence that there's some truth to that. So the question is, what is the extent and to what extent does it rise to the level of justifying what Israel's done there? And I think that remains to be seen.
How much tension do you think there is between the Israeli war cabinet and, President Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken? Because you get the impression that they're not as closely aligned as they were a few weeks ago.
Well, I think there's no question that we're delivering some tough messages behind the scenes to the Israelis, and I think the political calculus in the United States has changed. Obviously, with 11,000 Palestinian civilians killed, and increasing outcry, especially on the left here, it started to hurt Biden's poll numbers. It started to hurt his prospects for re-election, and I think, in addition to what I'm sure is the concern our folks have over the civilian casualties, there's also a political calculus that's entering into it now. And so I think behind the scenes, we're making the point very clearly to Netanyahu that we can't sustain this and he can't they can't sustain this over time unless there's a fundamentally different approach with respect to the humanitarian situation and civilian casualties. How much impact that's going to have on the Israeli calculus is hard to know. Bibi thinks about his own politics first and foremost. So I think he's much more likely to be persuaded by concerns from the hostages and their families than he is by any pressure from Biden privately. Now, that being said, we may increase the pressure on him publicly over time, and we'll see what kind of impact that has on the Israeli military objectives and operations.
And talking of which, Frank, looking at tomorrow morning's Financial Times front page, Israel signals operations shifting to southern Gaza after leaflet drops. So we're talking about people living in and around the city of Khan Yunis being told, and I quote, "For your safety, you have to evacuate your places of residence and head to the known shelters. Whoever is present near terrorists or their installations will be exposing their life to danger." And as one of my panelists a short time ago, Nadine Batchelor, said, where on earth are they going to go to? They've already been stuffed from northern Gaza into southern Gaza. Where can they go?
It's a great question. And I think the Israeli answer to that would be that there are humanitarian safe zones that have been established where they would presumably be safe. The question is, how do you get from Khan Yunis to wherever these safe areas are? What's the transportation? There's no fuel.
And Frank, would you even know? There's a lot of the communication breakdown every so often. The internet goes off, the phone signals are cut. How on earth would you know where is safe?
You're exactly right. And the answer is you probably don't. And there's a lot of these folks who have already traveled from the north down to the south. They've come to maybe stay with relatives or other places they think are safe. And now they're being told to leave there. They don't know where to go. They don't know how to get there. And it's really not a fair thing to ask of them to protect themselves in this situation. I think the Israelis are going to have to take a much more proactive approach towards clearing civilians out of these areas. If they're going to do the same thing in the south that they did in the north, there's no way that the international community will accept the number of civilian casualties and the humanitarian catastrophe that we're seeing going on for weeks and weeks more, which is what it'll take for the Israelis to do the same kind of operation in the south. So I think they're going to have to change their attitude towards that from one of, oh, hey, we warned them, to, hey, here's the major steps we're taking to make sure that these people are out of harm's way.
Yeah. And Frank, you're the former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That word negotiations, one wonders, who is talking to whom and at what level at this point, 5 weeks into this operation?
Yeah, well, we're talking, obviously, the Israelis are talking to Hamas through Qatar, trying to get the hostages released. But there's no meaningful dialogue, obviously, going on the underlying issues of the conflict. And I really think that presents a major challenge to Biden administration and also to the Israelis, which is that in the aftermath of this, there's no way you're going to get the international community to contribute tens of billions of dollars to reconstruct Gaza unless there's a path to a two-state solution. Netanyahu keeps saying that there's no way he's letting the Palestinian Authority back in there. Well, I don't know who he thinks is going to govern Gaza in terms of the municipal governance functions, taking out the garbage, issuing driver's license, policing. None of that stuff is going to be appropriate for the IDF to be engaged in. So you're going to need to get the Palestinian Authority back in there. The question is how? They don't have the capacity to go back in. And they've also said they will not go back in unless there's a path to a two-state solution. So in a political environment where everybody is incredibly angry and vilifying the other side, how are you going to create a credible dialogue which will be necessary for reconstruction and to get the PA back into Gaza? I think that's one of the major challenges that the Biden administration is thinking about and that we've been pushing the Israelis on.
And Frank, when you consider the level at which you were leading negotiations and the hope there was of a two-state solution, and you consider the rubble, the shambles of negotiations now, what do you think?
Well, listen, there's always been an argument that this situation had to get a lot worse before there was any chance it was really going to get better. And I think that this nadir that we're heading towards right now presents an opportunity to reset and to set the conflict on a different trajectory. I just don't think there's the political will on either side to take advantage of that opportunity. I think what the Biden administration is really going to do is press both sides to say, okay, we're committing to a path here that can lead to an independent Palestinian state. But the Netanyahu government is so extreme, so conservative. He's relying on them for his political survival. And there's no way they'll entertain anything remotely approaching a meaningful dialogue with the Palestinians. So there really has to be a better answer to that question than the one the Israelis are providing right now. And we'll see if either side is willing to take any kind of meaningful steps in that direction.
All right, Frank Lowenstein, thank you very much for your time. And Frank's a former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations.